This is the third part of our function series. And with functions, we use functions to modularize our code. We sometimes have to pass information into functions, so that's really part two where we're dealing with parameters. And sometimes we want functions to give us an answer. So we want to make a call and then you're going to give us an answer. So like when we're using a calculator and we type in 8 times 8, we expect an answer. Or if we're doing addition or something like that. Sometimes we just want an answer from our function. Examples of that could be given an employee ID of 55, bring back that employee record. Give me the employee that matches that ID. We're going to kind of simplify this and use some of our math examples, like just building out kind of like an addition method where you pass in two numbers and I'll give you the sum of those two numbers. Okay, so right now we're dealing with functions with returns. So that's the file that we're going to create. So I'm going to go ahead and create that new file, functions with returns. Okay, so this is the file. We are going to have, if I go back over to my HTML, the controller method. So that's our starting point. So here's our function called the controller. This is our starting point. And if I'm commenting this, this might be the application starting point. And the idea is that I will be given a number. So num1 equal to prompt. So I'm prompting the user. Enter the first number. And I want to convert that over to a number. So I'm going to convert that to a number. And then I want to do the same thing for num2. Okay, so num2, enter the second number. And this is easy enough where I could just add the two numbers, but like I said, I wanted to modularize this to kind of show you some of the detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a function called add numbers. And you're going to pass in two numbers. My initial inclination is to say that the numbers coming into this function are going to be num1 and num2, but I don't want to confuse the point of here's two variables, num1 and num2. They are not accessible in this function. Okay, I can't add them. Okay, so if I try to add those numbers, okay, the idea with this function is I want to add two numbers together and return the sum of those two numbers. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to say return num1 plus num2. And in part 2 of our function series, we saw that these numbers are not accessible to us, so we can't use them. Okay, so I can't just call add numbers and get a result. Okay, and you'll notice this is a little bit different. So I'm creating a variable saying take the return value from this function and store it in this variable called result. So I'm trying to return the sum of num1 and num2. This is going to fail because num1 and num2 are not accessible to my function, but we'll fix that here in a second. Okay, so I open it up in a browser, I say 10 and 20 for the first and second numbers, and you'll see I don't get any values. If I look at my console, I get an error saying num1 is not defined on line 7. So it's complaining about num1 on line 7. If I make num1 available, then it'd complain about num2. They don't exist. These numbers are defined in the controller function. They don't exist in the add numbers function. Okay, so here's where this will add to some confusion, but please don't be confused. So I'm going to create a variable called num1 and num2. These are parameters. They are incoming parameters into the add numbers function. And it's going to look like this works. Okay, and it kind of does. So 10 and 20. I didn't do anything with the result. That's why we're not seeing the result. So I guess I should output the result. Okay, so let's try that again, 10 and 20. It tells me it's not a number. Interesting. It's not a number because I didn't pass in num1 and num2. I didn't pass in the user entered values, 10 and 20. So you'll notice now I'm getting 30. It's working. Okay, so this is where functions get a little bit confusing in JavaScript. So I have two variables, num1 and num2. These variables exist only within this function. Then up in add numbers, I have two new variables, num1 and num2. Okay, they just happen to be the same name. They do not have to be the same name, but they happen to be the same name. I can call them anything I want. For kind of to use good variable names, num1 and num2 I think makes sense, but I'm going to show you that I can call these things anything I want. I'm going to call them A and B, and I'm going to return the result of A and B. And this probably doesn't make as much sense to you the first time you're seeing it, but I assure you that this will work as well. So 10 and 20. Okay, the idea here is that I'm creating two new variables, and these variables are meant to hold the values that were passed in. So the value that was passed in was whatever the user entered for num1. That value gets passed in as the value of A. Num2, the value gets passed in as the value of B. So A is equal to 10, B is equal to 20, and we return the sum of A and B. Okay, so we return the sum of A and B, we get 30, and that return value then gets assigned to our variable called result. And that's how we output the result. So the way this works is, let's assume that the user enters 10 for num1 and 20 for num2. I pass 10 and 20 to my function add numbers. So most of the time when I describe this, I would describe this as saying we're passing in num1 and num2 to the add numbers function. That's not entirely true. We're using those variables to get the values of num1 and num2. We're not actually passing the variables. We're passing the value of the variable, and it's different. And it's kind of, we'll expand on this as we go forward, but just know that we're passing the value of num1 to our function. We're passing the value of num2 to our function, and then A takes on that value for num1, and B takes on the value of num2. So A takes on the value 10, B takes on the value 20. We return the result. So this return statement basically says, I'm done executing the function, return to the call. Okay, so when I call add numbers, I hit that return statement. That's what brings me back to line 19 saying, I'm done. I have the answer. It's 30. This whole value that I have highlighted becomes the value 30, and then 30 gets stored in the variable result. And that's what we end up writing out. Okay, so if I save this and I refresh this, I can use 5 and 15. So 5 would be the value that gets passed into A, 15 would be the value that gets passed into B, and I return the result, which is 20. One thing about the return statement is as soon as I hit a return statement, so let's say I return the value 50, as soon as I hit a return statement, no more code after line 7 is going to get executed. So my function add numbers, regardless of what I pass in for A and B, it's always going to return 50 now. I probably wouldn't want to write a function this way, but that's the way this function is currently working. So I type in 1 and 2, the value is 50. If I type in 25 and 50, the value is 50. The value is always 50 because I hit this return statement saying, hey, I'm done, here's the answer. So most of the time your return statement is the last thing that your function does. So you run all your calculations, you do all of your work in your function, and then the last thing you do is you return the answer. Okay, so if you have code after the return statement, that code is never going to execute. So you probably don't want that code in the first place. The last thing in your function definition is very typically a return statement, returning an answer. Okay, so this is a demo on how to use return values with functions. So this is kind of the end of our three-part series on how to use functions in JavaScript.